And I'm looking forward to it. A lot of questions, I'm sure. We have the panel here for answers. So, Mike, I'm just going to, everybody knows you. And then we have Mike Cummings, Superintendent of School.
Good evening.
Sands Cleary, Director of the Health Department.
Evening.
And I hope I'm going down the road the right way. And Jim Olson from Tighe Bond.
Good evening.
And finally, Brian Carey, who's the Interim Public Works Superintendent, Director and Conservation Director. Got that straight. So, Mike, if you want to start off, and then I'll feed the questions.
Okay, very good. Just want to kind of set the stage a bit. We've gone through a lot, and we've covered a lot of ground in the last 5 or 6 weeks on this. We've tried to set up a system of communication, both in getting emails out to the public as we have different releases, and sometimes those are coming out every couple days as we have information to update people. If you're not getting those emails and would like to, if you go to our town website and sign up for First Selectman updates, you'll be on that list, and you can stay on that as long as you like, and you can unsubscribe later if you're not interested in following any longer. In addition, we set up a web page, fairfieldct.org/fill-use-issues. So on that one web page, we are collecting all the information historically, all the test results. We have a scorecard, if you will, that tracks all the fields that we've tested, all the ones that we're planning to test on the town side and on the Board of Ed side. So there's one place to go see all that, and we'll continue to keep that updated. You know, the priority as we've gone through this from day one was to make sure the fields are safe and to make sure our kids are safe. And to that end, we moved very quickly to test the fields, get the results back, and identify where we need remediation. Fortunately, the fields have come back safe as defined by the Department of Health and the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. There have been some exceedances above the residential standard, and we are going back and we will remediate those specific areas, and they've been fairly limited hotspots so far, and we're going to go back and remediate those down to the residential standard, primarily because that's the only standard that exists today. As much as these are recreational fields, don't have the same exposure levels that a residential standard would require. It's the only standard we have, so we're going to go back to that. From a next step, as we've got the testing underway, remediation underway, and my colleagues up here will define that in more detail, both for the school system and for the town. We're starting to take some next steps. One is recommending we set up a environmental safety committee made up of 5 to 7 members of the public to help provide the public oversight and transparency that we want to see in this process going forward. If the last 4 or 5 weeks we were moving in very much a crunch time to get things started up to speed, we now are at the point that we want to make sure that on an ongoing basis, not only with Julian Pile issues, but we set up a separate email account for people to send in questions to. And those come into the health department, and our commitment is to the extent that we can answer those in 24 hours, we do. To the extent that we at least acknowledge those, some of the questions are what I'll call more than 24-hour answers, to go back and do that. And we are looking for this committee going forward to help both with respect to Julian Pile issues, but also with respect to areas that are not Julian Pile related. One of the questions that came in said, hey, on Jennings Beach, there was dredging material that was put on the beach. You know, is that going to be tested? There's some other questions come in on areas that Julian fill, to the best that we can tell, was not used. But that doesn't mean we don't want to answer those questions. And going forward, we may decide that this environmental safety committee is something that we want to keep around on an ongoing basis, so that we always have the ability to answer those questions about how safe do we want our town and what comes up from time to time. So we will look at setting that up, but that would be a Board of Selectmen committee, as I'm proposing it today. so that we can move very quickly and get this set up in 2 to 3 weeks and get them involved in the process of reviewing sites for potential testing and remediation. In addition, I'm recommending that our Ethics Commission help us look at our Code of Ethics and our Standards of Conduct and go back and let's look at strengthening those, enhancing those. I think that, and also providing some training. The idea is that we want to do this to support our employees. We want to let them know here's what's expected, but also here's what you need to see. And it's okay to raise an issue. It's okay to raise a question. It's okay to point something out if you have concerns about that. One of the things we've seen going through this process is a number of our employees would have pointed things out sooner, but they were concerned about either retaliation or what might happen, or there wasn't an easy enough way to do that. So as part of that, we've set up a whistleblower hotline for both phone and email. This will be anonymous. It'll be managed by a third party. And again, in the interest of public oversight, I'm going to ask that our Ethics Commission handle these questions when they came in so somebody can track those. They still need to get into town hall eventually so that we actually take action. But the idea is that our Ethics Commission would in fact provide the audit trail or control, if you will, to make sure each of those questions gets answered. I would ask that they report back to the Board of Selectmen, perhaps twice a year, initially, and then twice a year, but then after that, as needed. I suspect initially there's enough of a backlog that it would probably be monthly to the Board of Selectmen to start, and we'll see how that goes. But that'll be up to the Ethics Commission to kind of summarize the calls, and that way it's very public. Everybody knows what categories things are coming in with, and the Ethics Commission can assure that every question gets answered. I think with that kind of a brief update from this side, I'm going to turn it back to Mr. Bradley.
Do you have any other comments from the panel before we get started? Yeah.
Good evening again. My name is Mike Cummings. I'm the Superintendent of Schools. I just wanted to follow up on Mr. Tetro's comments and to clarify some of the, from my understanding, might be some misconceptions about the work that the Board of Education, the public schools, is doing. In addition to the list of sites that the town has identified, and in reaction to that, the schools then close some additional sites, some of the playgrounds and playscapes. And I want to clarify, just in terms of vocabulary, the playscapes we identify as those places at the school sites where there is playground equipment. So those are the playscapes, and the playgrounds we identify more broadly as the grassy areas. We closed some additionally just to make sure that since the concerns were being raised around the conditions of some of the fields, we wanted to be thorough and make sure that those, all the fields we had thoroughly tested and could declare safe. We are close to finishing and getting all of our results. We have a number of locations still that we're awaiting results, but as they come in, we continue to work to clarify what we can open. And on the Fairfield Public Schools website, we have a link to a site that is about the fields. And that site, we, like the town, post the testing results, any ancillary information that would go with that, and simply denote whether a field or playscape is open or closed. So as you'll see, the majority of those places now are open, and again, we await some further testing and to determine the rest of those. Thank you.
Okay, and you have some, Sands, you have some comments?
Sure. So I was asked just to give a brief summary of sort of the process so far. So I will try to do that as best I can in a brief format. So there's essentially been 5 different rounds of testing so far. We've got Gould Manor Park, where all that testing has been completed. We are out currently accepting bids for a remediation contractor. That bid period closes the week from September 26th, a week from Thursday. So that project is moving forward. We have the what we call the priority sites list. That was the first list put out. All that testing has been completed. 10 of those sites require no further action. We did move one of those sites to the second list There was the additional school field testing that Superintendent Cummings just mentioned, and the additional school playscape testing. And then what was kind of going on at the same time is what we call delineation testing, where we found some issue at a particular field, some contaminant above a level. Additional testing was done to define that area better to guide the remediation plan. Last Friday, we released what we termed the supplemental list of sites. These are additional sites that either we came across new information, or these are information of other sites where we're able to tie invoices to a particular location and identify the site on that, the areas on that site. So that's the list that's coming now for testing or assessment, I'll say. And then what may happen after that is some additional remediation delineation testing. As Mike had mentioned, the health department's been responding to the fill use questions email. We've responded to well over 100 different emails there. Most of those emails, there's multiple follow-up questions that usually happen, and so we're doing our best to get to those. We were caught up as of all of them last Friday. We received 4 today, and 3 of those have already been responded to, so we're doing well on that. We try to get to them as fast as we can, but as Mike said, sometimes, you know, the questions that are asked are ones that take multiple departments to weigh in on and provide commentary, or we have to simply refer that to another department based upon the nature of the question. You know, we don't answer detailed purchasing questions or issues about HR and some of those types of issues. So total to date, we've got about 25 different sites that have been tested. We have 13 of those with no exceedances. We have the additional supplemental site of 20 sites that we're looking at. We have so we're still awaiting, as Superintendent Cummings alluded to, some additional testing results that are coming in, and we are working towards remediation on a number of those sites, approximately 8 sites or so right now that we're working towards remediation. And so that is my update.
Jim Olson?
Good evening. Again, I'm Jim Olson from Tighe Bond. I'm a licensed environmental professional. Our firm's been leading the investigations and remediation planning for this project. And, you know, Sansa described all the sites we had investigated. And as Sansa indicated, there are several sites that appear to need remediation. The first one on that priority list is the Gould Manor Park, which was the first site we investigated. Has some exceedances of lead and arsenic, and there's also some asbestos, non-friable asbestos in the fill. And it pretty much occurs along the sidewalk, and it goes out anywhere from a few inches to a couple feet along the sidewalk, running the length of the roadway there. So we prepared a remedial action plan and technical specifications in consultation with the Connecticut Department of Health. We prepared those documents and submitted them to Department of Health and Department of Energy Environmental Protection for their information and awaiting any comments they have. And the remediation will consist of simply of excavating these materials and removing them and disposing them of an off-site licensed facility, a secure facility where these materials will be capped and basically entombed. When the materials are excavated, we'll do some additional soil sampling along those excavation trenches to confirm that we removed all the contaminants. During excavation, we're going to monitor dust and air monitoring to confirm that it's done safely. The contractor is going to be required to maintain strict dust controls. Tighe Bond will be out there observing the contractor. And then once the excavation is completed and the soil samples come back, we'll backfill the area and reseed it and restore it to its original condition. There's several other sites we're doing some additional investigation on. Right now it appears there'll be some limited spot excavations in some of the sports fields, pretty limited excavations coming in for a day or so, removing some materials and collecting confirmation samples and backfilling it. So I think things are moving along well, and we're getting our hands around issues and, planning on remediating these sites in a timely fashion.
Great. I guess we're prepared and ready for any questions from the audience. Our rule is the usual 2-minute rule, if you can stick with that, if at all possible. And we're going to go through and let everybody have an opportunity to ask questions. And also the panelists are going to stay behind after we end, if there are anybody that wants to talk to any one of the individuals on a one-to-one basis. So, questions? We need your name and address, and the question would be great.
They come up to the microphone.
Jim, there's Mike set up over here.
Okay, you can go right over there.
Good evening. Suzanne Miska, 123 Rygate Road. In December of 2016, I attended the Sherman meeting discussing the Julian pile. Mr. Carey was present, Mike, you were present, Mr. Bartlett, Mr. Michelangelo, and we had a discussion. It was a raucous discussion, but a discussion nonetheless. So my question is, in 2016, in December, after that presentation and all the people and neighborhoods were being addressed, why then, when we knew that there was contaminants, did we not go through this process? Why did it take until an investigation takes place that we've now decided to go back and find out where the fill has gone? Why 3 years? I mean, so if there had been no investigation, would we be doing this testing? Those are my 2 questions.
Okay. I think those are probably directed at me, so I'll be happy to step that. As the Julian contract was winding down, kind of as part of our due diligence, so we went through and hired a licensed environmental professional, not Mr. Olson, but another firm, to come in and test the pile on a random basis. We thought it best, if there were any irregularities or contaminants, that we find those while Julian was still on site, so we could make them address them. That started in September of 2016, continued through October of 2016 to November of 2016, and on into December. On November 29th, our LEP observed a Julian truck or 2, I think, actually come in and dump a load away from the work area, away from where the other trucks that were routinely coming in and dumping their loads. So she followed that, walked over and tested it. It came back high in PCBs and lead. That was December 13th. We immediately shut the yard down. We immediately asked Julian to leave the site. We invited Deep to come down. They came down that afternoon, reviewed with them what we had, and then followed their instruction and guidance from that point. Up to that point in time, all the testing we've done showed that the pile met the normal expectations for the aggregate material of that type and was within the commercial industrial standards. The material that came in that was identified to have PCBs, we profiled that, as was described earlier, basically identified how extensive that was, how deep it was, came up with a plan approved by DEEP to remove that, and that material was appropriately disposed of in another state. At that point in time, we didn't know that any of this fill had been used on ball fields and parks. So as much as this met standards for commercial or industrial use, it did not meet standards for ballparks or ball fields.
But I appreciate that, but as the first selectman, I mean, I would have thought that your first thing would have been to bring in your employees that were involved in this contract. I mean, as it wasn't signed by you or approved by the Board of Selectmen, wouldn't you have brought in your 2 big employees, the supervisor and DPW head, and said, like, what's the worst case scenario that we're dealing with? I mean, where has this stuff been going, just in case this becomes a problem or an issue? Like, you know, honestly, to now hear that we want to create volunteer commissions, and we're going to ask the ethics commission to get involved. I mean, I really think it's our house. It's your house. You're the first selectman. And so I would think that it's for you and Mr. Hibson to sit down in HR and set the precedent for the town under your administration. You know, so I don't understand like why there was no urgency felt other than to file the lawsuit, which I appreciate. But I don't understand like why you wouldn't have done due diligence with your own staff to be like, hey, you know, this is a mess and we need to figure out what the worst case scenario is. I mean, honestly, my opinion, and I know this isn't a question and I apologize, but you know, the last thing you want is volunteers coming in to answer all of these questions that, to me, that's what the department heads and the people who are sitting at town hall are supposed to be doing. I mean, I think it's kind of an unfair thing to now ask somebody else to step in and do this. So I strongly suggest we look at a different scenario. And I am disappointed, as I said the day in Sherman School, that their trust has been broken. And trust is a hard thing to win back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lisa Davey, 53 Adelaide Street. My questions relate to the berm particularly and the pile. You indicated just now that they did testing after, you know, in September of 2016. I believe Julian was running the pile for 3 years prior. Was there any testing previous to that September of 16? That's the first question. The other question is, we did, I believe, put money into the remediation prior to building the berm. But what did we remediate? How far down have we tested this pile? It's 2.5 times from 13 to 16. So do we have contaminants just sitting, leaching into the groundwater?
Want me to answer that? So I think the two issues kind of get a little bit commingled between the fill we're addressing now, which we've tested all these sites through Board of Ed, some townside properties, and you know what we're finding is very low levels of PAH compounds. The material that was dumped on the site that was the focus of the remediation in February to the June 17th timeframe was actually demolition material that was, you know, brick, concrete, and things that were testing positive for PCBs. So it was not commingled with the larger pile, and we ended up taking out about 2,100 yards of that material that was basically not the same as the rest of the aggregate pile that was up at the site. You know, when we had those meetings at Sherman for, I forget the course of time, but I think it was 2 years, you know, it was made very clear that a lot of the material that the town basically develops in the course of paving roads and issues like that is sub-base that has asphalt in it. And, you know, the state allows a certain amount of asphalt to be blended into soil where it can be met the definition of clean fill. So, you know, when Public Works strips roads down to the level of below the binder course, there's dirt that has asphalt in it. And all towns deal with these types of issues because it's just a byproduct of living in an urbanized environment. So there are contaminants, meaning low levels of PAHs and things like that, that are, you know, that are always known to be at that pile. It was segregated into pieces. But the material that was dumped there, that started basically the remediation in December, January, February, and that period of time, that was really the heart of the lawsuit that the town entered into against Julian, was absolutely fully characterized and put out to bid for remediation, and over the whole process was overseen by an LEP and by myself. And the reason why is that PCBs are obviously a different class of compounds with different regulatory standards, and you know that was something that, you know, if you meet regulatory thresholds because of the levels, EPA will get involved. We never met those thresholds. And just one thing that should be made known is that we've never received a notice of violation from the DEP. We've never received a consent order from the DEP. We're really operating under no legal mechanism that would require the town to go out and to address all of these issues from a state permitting standpoint. The closure of the solid waste landfill, which we're trying to get our hands around, we are in the process of dealing with that. But right now, the town, in accordance with the Public Health Department and the DEP, is doing everything proactively to address the issues.
Okay, so to get back to the question, was any testing done between 2013 and 2016? Is it required, and/or was it done? And if the pile grew by 2.5 times in 3 years, how far down, if we didn't test till 2016, how far down did we go? I understand that you were looking at a separate dumping site and that there would be some asphalt and other items, but you're not answering the question of, were we monitoring it all along? Because we allowed someone else to run the pile for us.
So as part of the solid waste closure process, they were testing material before they were placing it into the berm.
Who was testing it?
Osprey Environmental, who was the town's LEP working for Public Works Yard.
Okay,
and
so
all
they
that
were
information.
testing it when they were building the berm.
Correct.
But not between 2013 and 2016. There was no
There was no
monitoring.
testing being done. There was stormwater monitoring being done at the time, which basically, collects runoff from the site. But as far as soil sampling, I have not seen any. I believe they were
Doing the catch basin?
Yes. So the catch basin waste.
So that as they built the berm, they actually tested the material
They did.
being moved.
And if it came back above certain thresholds, if you read the permit that they wrote and the design plan, then it would have had to been removed off.
And do we know if it was?
We never went over industrial criteria, so they did not have to remove the materials off the berm.
But other than groundwater, nothing was tested for
So,
those first 3 years?
So so surface water, basically the stuff that runs off the
Right.
landfill. But groundwater in that area there's basically, it's in an area that there's institutional controls, meaning that if you were to come in for a well permit, a domestic well, you would not be able to get a permit from the health department because the area is in a GB groundwater area, which prevents homeowners from basically going in and getting well permits. So everyone's on city water.
Right, I understand that.
So there's,
But we're at sea level, basically, where this is.
I agree. But the groundwater in that area is it's not acceptable for human consumption. And that is based on, institutional controls that the state put down on us on groundwater quality.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Bill Gerber, 25 Shady Hill Road, and I'm a RTM rep from District 2. So these are questions that I've gotten from constituents, and I have a bunch of them, so I can stop and circle back up. Mr. Bradley, just tell me if you want
Why
me
don't
to
you
stop.
start and we'll stop you.
Okay, so my
We have
first
to.
question is Lake Mohegan. Is there any plan to test there, or is any testing going on? Where? How? What?
Yeah, so Lake Mohegan is now on the second set, the supplemental list, and my understanding is the area that's subject to testing is around the trailhead, right? When you enter into they place some crushed stone in that area, and so that's the materials that were brought in there. That's subject to review for assessment.
Okay, so that will be, that's for the next round?
Yes.
Is there concerns about water runoff, I know from the pile, but from other sites, and is sort of a plan to explore what sort of environmental damage could have been done from water runoff from other contaminated sites being explored?
We've had some discussions internally about that, and with Department of Public Health, there's been no advice to go beyond, it's in an urban environment like this, you know, the stormwater runoff is going to have a number of things in it, and with pesticides from yards and fertilizers and gasoline and oils from driveways and, you know.
So the soil samples that we're collecting are actually, the way the RSRs work is most of the soil is tested for two reasons. One is for a direct exposure criteria, which means physical contact, but the soil samples are also compared against what's called a pollutant mobility criteria, which is actually the ability of those materials to leach out of the soils, which would cause groundwater impacts. And all the data we've collected to date does not show any, high exceedances in that.
Sort of as an addendum to, have you had requests from sort of neighbors of some of these sites to go and test their properties? Or?
So there's concerns that, from people that it has has a contractor used material in my yard, and I don't have any information.
Oh, okay, so that's as the actual fill, not from a runoff perspective. You haven't.
No. So again, the RSR criteria that we're comparing all the data from, it's kind of baked in there to, if it's not coming back high in pollutant mobility criteria standards, it's protective of surface water and groundwater.
Okay, thank you.
And I did have two discussions with two homeowners regarding that. They, we had a discussion about it in person.
Yeah.
And they did not feel any urgency to, after our discussion, to request additional testing.
So
okay.
just to back up on my point about GB and GA, I know that's very confusing, but it's water quality classification standards, and the DEP requires different soil criteria for different areas. The area that's in a GA is, reserved for human domestic supply, if they, if so choose. We have city water throughout most of the town. Now, if you went down to the urban areas and, anywhere in Connecticut, you're not going to be using that for domestic supplies, so the standards are a little bit higher, but they're still protective of human health and the environment.
Anyone, feel free to come up and knock me out here. But the next question is in terms of some of the sort of the forensic, accounting with the invoices and what went in, what went out. Is there anything that's come out of that that's going to let us know about the possibility of new contaminated sites or sites that need to be tested based on transportation in and out of of the site?
It's possible. We're part of the delays and the issues of getting the information out is we're learning new stuff every day, about these sites. So, I think we shared at the last public forum that, and a few hours before we found out information about 2 additional school sites, which, we were advised that, this is related to a trench at Osborne School, and this is related to Tomlinson School. So there's the potential that we will find out additional sites, but there's also the potential that some of these sites will fall out. I just found out an hour and a half ago that, for example, the fire training school is on the site, is on the list of sites, and that the fire chief spoke with the individual at the state who was managing the contracts and said, no, that, there was no Julian fill used at that site, that those invoices are for paying Julian to haul material away from the site, and to another location. And so
right.
That's, so that site might fall off the list, and so we're learning information as we go. It's we're trying to tie it together as best as we can.
This wasn't my question, but just to follow up on my own edification, are the new sites that you're finding coming from individuals reporting things to you that, hey, I saw stuff going in there, or are you getting information from the records of Julian or or of the town at this
So
point?
we don't have any records from Julian. We have records that have invoices that Julian gave to the town. And so we're using those as one source. We're having discussions with engineering, conservation, and public works about projects that went on during that time period? What projects were you working on? What issues? We're also getting phone calls and emails from residents about projects that happened that Public Works did the work, and was there any fill used in this project? You know, and so what we have a process of looking into the time period. Was it within the time period that the site was being operated by Julian? And you know, what was the material used? And you know, did the town use any materials on that, or was it from outside materials? So sometimes it's materials purchased from outside, and then we can rule that site out. But sometimes sometimes some of those things are on the list that it's likely that we may have used that type of fill there, and so we put it on the list for further assessment.
Okay. This next question, I think Mr. Carey answered it, but a question on Gould Manor Pond and whether the water needs to be tested at Gould Manor Pond.
No, so this issue of stormwater sediments keeps coming up, and you know, anytime you have a pond that's a stormwater receiving body, it's going to have PAHs in the bottom because that stormwater source is from off the road. So, you know, any time, and you know, even for private pond dredging projects that we have people come in and get permits from on a wetland side of permitting, we require, you know, documentation to show how they're going to reuse that material, because again, it's inconsistent. So, you know, the town does have information that the dredge materials at the bottom of the Gould Manor has, you know, material on it, but there's no direct exposure issue because, you know, it's at the bottom of the sediment. Now, when and if we have to go and dredge that pond, which is on, you know, the capital plan to do so, you know, that material would have to be handled in a manner that is consistent with the law. You know, the four bays where the water comes in and settles out, they generally have road, you know, constituents from asphalt and, you know, oil coming off the road, and then it settles around those areas, and then the deeper part of the pond is generally, you know, lower. So when you go in and dredge the ponds, you have to basically manage those contaminated areas a little different than the other. But as far as like, we don't have an ongoing, so the difference between the fill that we're dealing with and what makes it different than an ongoing spill is that the fill is placed inconsistently over an area. So if you had an oil tank that were to leak or some type of surface spill, it would kind of follow a pattern that you could go out and basically delineate and then remove that area. But when fill's placed, it's mixed, pre-mixed, and then laid out over a large area. So it's not as consistent in its remediation. Now, surface water in Gould Manor, you know, yes, there's fecal coliforms and E. coli and things like that, which we do have watershed management plans for all the towns. So we do test the larger watersheds, Rooster River, Mill River, and South Sasko Brook. So we know that there's some impairments in those rivers from, you know, again, could be septic inputs or, you know, even wildlife inputs. But we have that testing in place, and we do it because we are required to kind of improve water quality throughout the watersheds in the town, if that makes sense. So that's why when you come in and, you know, you put a deck or a shed or, you know, addition on, we require you that you put infiltrators in the ground because that's protective of surface water.
Okay. Next question is, if anyone else, please feel free to go. Next question is about the Penfield Pavilion. There was some discussion about fill used there. Is that tested, or is it going to be tested?
That's on the supplemental supplemental list of sites to be assessed.
Okay. There was a question about Jennings. If it's true that it could not have had fill from the pile, can we explain the likely source of the negative test results, if indeed it didn't receive Julian fill?
Jennings Elementary School field?
Yeah.
Okay.
Where would that have come from?
So the information related to a lot of the school testing that from that first set of lists was, we talked to Public Works about, so there was an email that described in 2015, in the fall of 14, several schools received some larger field dressing, they call it, where they took out the goalie areas in the center of the field that gets beat up a little bit more, and they substantially replaced a lot of that material. In the spring of 2015, Public Works did that work. In the spring of 2015, this is going back looking at emails, that those fields had what they described as poor quality fill with lots of rocks and some glass in there. And so what happened is the new field contractor that had been hired in the interim period, we were told, came out and removed most of that poor quality fill and brought in better quality fill from an outside source. But regardless, we were advised that most of the soccer fields, most of the sort of competition soccer fields throughout the years would receive materials in the goalie areas and in the center of the fields where the field got beat up a little bit. And depending on the work, sometimes depending on the season, if it was in season, they'd put sod back over those areas. If it was out of season, they would put grass seed on there and let it grow. So that's what led to testing of those sites. Because there's some suspicion of Julian fill being used at those. So at Jennings School, that was one of those fields that received a large field dressing. But when we tested the field for the soils that were currently there, the field area had no elevations, no exceedances.
So there was a hit of arsenic next to the playground at 13.7, which is
outside of the field.
Outside of the
Right,
field.
I think I should have said playscape.
So arsenic is part of pressure-treated wood, that they no longer use anymore since 2004. But if you test pressure-treated wood that was installed prior to 2004, it has arsenic. And most of the playgrounds prior to the new metal playscapes that you see were basically built out of pressure-treated wood. So, there's probably some remnants left in the soil from that. But it was basically a one-off hit, and they did further delineation around that area, and it's one spot. So, what the remediation looks like for that site, it's either go in and dig out a 55-gallon drum, or we could talk about covering it or something. But
right.
there is still effects from pressure-treated creosote wood that does have remnant arsenic in it.
Okay. Thank you.
And in addition, arsenic is found in soils throughout the state
Right.
at varying levels. So it's not out of the ordinary of a level that you would find if you were to test anywhere.
This for Tighe Bond. The question was, they're testing at the level of 6 to 8 inches deep. Is that right? Can you just talk about that? What happens if you go 2 to 3 feet deep? And I think there was some discussion about people going out and doing some digging on their own. But how would you interpret results from different levels? And
Sure. Based on the information that was reported to us, the fill was primarily used in areas of the sports fields that were subject to wear and tear, where there was divots in front of goalies along the center line of the field. So, that was generally a few inches deep. So we went under that premise, and then when we did our investigation, we peeled back the sod and the topsoil, and we looked for any signs of fill, and we hand excavated to the limits of the fill. And generally we saw, about 6 inches or so, 6 inches to a foot deep. And then beyond that, it was a native material.
okay.
So it was both what was reported to us and also what we saw in the field.
How deep when you hit sort of native material, you stopped basically. Or you could stop.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
And I had a question about the process of collecting samples. Do you go out with a team from your firm to collect samples?
Yes, we use trained personnel from our firm, environmental scientists who have college degrees and years of experience collecting environmental samples. They follow industry standard operating protocols. There's quality control and assurance followed through that process.
So you don't rely on anyone from outside of your firm?
We submit the soil samples to an independent laboratory, a state-certified laboratory, and we've been using Phoenix Laboratories in Manchester, Connecticut.
In terms of collection, though?
Correct. No, we collect, only
Okay.
Tighe Bond collects samples.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay. And please, someone, you want to go? You want to come up?
I'll just follow up. There is a chain of custody protocol, though, so before,
Finish up, you can't have that
Okay.
many more.
there's chain of
I
custody.
do have more, actually, a few more, but feel free to.
There is strict chain of protocol custody for when they collect the sample and bring it to the lab, which is set by state law.
Right, right. Okay, would you like to? Oh, okay. I had a question on wildlife testing. Is that a valid indicator? Is that something that's part of, or a valid part of a process like this? Of testing birds or, dead animals? I'm not exactly sure what it means, but.
So I would say we have enough data now to say that this is not this huge issue as far as the levels we're determining. So there really would be no type of, if you had high levels of lead or something like that, you could put together like a bioassessment program. But I mean, we have enough data to show that it's not these, it's one-off kind of hits that are, related to asphalt in the soil or, playscape that has arsenic from the pressure-treated wood. That's just not that widespread. Now, there are projects that would rise to that level, but and everything we're seeing, nothing has been that, those levels have not been there. So
Okay.
my professional opinion, no, that's not something you would need to do. If it rose to that level, yes, we would be doing that.
Since I actually only have one more question, but you could save this for later, is for Selectman Tetreault, about the independent commission. Could you clarify before the night is over your intention in terms of, I think that I read something in the paper where there was a response that sort of, oh, you're trying to push this on the lay people, whether or not that's the intention, or is that your health department is still, it's essentially what I assumed was that it's sort of where the reporting is going, or who's being, who's discussing reports, that actually the health department is still in charge of a lot of the work. It's just that they are feeding information through with others to a separate body. But I think it's important to clarify that.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. The idea is that the health department and the other departments in town are still going to be doing the work they are today in terms of following up. The idea is to add a layer of transparency and public oversight, simply put, to make sure that all the questions that come in get answered. I think that, Mr. Gerber, you and I had a discussion just the other day about, were all the questions getting answered? My response was yes, because we have them all coming into the health department and they're tracking them through. But somebody's saying, well, how do we know that nothing gets dropped, everything gets through? So the idea is to provide that level of oversight and transparency so everybody's comfortable that all the questions that come in, whether they're pile related or not, get answered. Obviously, the focal point here initially has been to answer questions relating to the Julian pile. As we see other types of questions come in, several that you've asked here tonight, we want to make sure those all get answered too.
Thank you. That's what I was hoping that the intent was. Thank you so much.
Actually, at 2 minutes a question, you're right on time.
Nancy Haberly, Duck Farm Road. I'm hearing just a lot of remediation and scientists and a lot of layers and a lot of work that's going on. And I think the bottom line is that who's going to pay for all this? And I think we all know the answer to that, but I still have to ask the question.
Yeah, we're going to go back and take a look at what the costs are. Right now, most of the costs are on testing. Fortunately, the remediation has come back as pretty minor and limited so remediation would be a much bigger cost.
Right.
But we will put together a plan of between looking at budget adjustments this year, but also looking potentially at some funding from some of the reserve we have from last year
Okay.
to put this.
Does the state get involved you know, I have no idea, so
Yeah,
I'm just asking.
In terms of external sources,
Right.
we're going to go after Julian, obviously, and we're doing that in part. We're going to go after their insurance, and we're going to look at our insurance to help with that. So I don't mean to say those were the only sources below, but we've got several things, and part of that will depend on exactly how much all this costs.
Right.
Uh,
Do you have an expectation of how much it will be?
Until the testing's
Yeah.
done, it's hard to identify. I mean, fortunately, say in the school system, when you look at all the fields they tested,
Right.
but how many came back not needing any remediation?
Right.
We still had to pay for the test, but not having to pay for the remediation is a big cost avoidance.
Right.
So what we're coming back with is relatively low levels of remediation needed.
Yes.
So that's the biggest help in terms of minimizing the cost impact.
Okay. And just, I mean, general, you know, people have been arrested. This is very negative for the town, just and how operations are happening, and nepotism, and there's just a lot of things that are just very sleazy. And it's just kind of, I would hope that people who work for the town, there's just got to be checks and balances and layers. And I mean, yes, I understand these people's lives are, you know, ruined, but, you know, they made choices. And, you know, I'm a big person about justice, you know, like, wow, you know, you do something bad, you pay the price. You know, you have to be an upstanding citizen. And I would hope that people in our town are here for the benefit of the town. And I mean, this is affecting children, and it's such a big deal. So I appreciate you all being here. I just hope that in the future that maybe other layers or levels, or when people are hired, it's just important to get quality people who have values that really you want in our town. So thank you.
Thank you. Other questions?
My name is Jim Gallagher. I live on Congress Street here in Fairfield. It's become apparent to me that a lot of the materials that have been tested recently and the toxicity levels are relatively low. A good reason for that is a lot of these materials have been subjected to erosion and rainwater and foot traffic for the past 4 or 5 years. They were probably significantly more toxic 4 or 5 years ago. And we have had children and adults and dogs running through all of these toxic materials for the past 3, 4, 5 years, and then jumping in our cars and bringing them home. My question is probably to Mr. Cleary. The very dedicated moms and dads that take care of their houses and vacuum their houses every day have clearly contaminated their vacuums with this material. And rather than just worry about excavating these little shovelfuls of soil, we all have this stuff in our houses now, and it's no longer being diluted by foot traffic or rainwater or erosion. The toxicity levels remain where they were the day that it came into our houses. So my question is, what do you suggest to parents that they do with their vacuums and brooms and car carpeting and everything else that has been contaminated with all of this toxic material?
Well, again, I don't know if I would necessarily agree with the overall characterization of large amounts of toxic material making it their way into homes. I think people.
I didn't say large amounts of toxic. And you know what? I'm going to continue because really I've had it up to my eyebrows with the minimization of this toxicity in our town. I don't know if you know my background. My wife was a teacher in the town of Fairfield, Joy Gallagher. She was exposed to toxicity in her classroom. And everybody in this godforsaken town told the two of us, it's just minimal. Don't worry about it. It's just minimal. My wife developed cancer. I spend every morning visiting my wife at Oaklawn Cemetery now because you guys told us, oh, it's minimal, don't worry about it. And you are completely irresponsible telling the people in the town of Fairfield that it's minimal, don't worry about it. hopefully for your sake, you'll be out of here in 4 or 5 years before any of these kids get sick. Unfortunately for me, my wife was the one that did respond to this stuff fairly immediately, so don't you dare tell anybody that it's minimal and it's not toxic. It is. It killed my wife.
Okay.
Thank you. I think you've made a very good point in a very delicate situation, but I don't know whether we're going to go any further with this right now. Points well made, points, argument well made, argument received.
I still need an explanation on what moms and dads should do with their own houses and properties.
So I would, my suggestion would be that the normal daily cleaning practices of keeping your home clean, removing dust, the same things that go on. Most every house in Fairfield that was built before 1978 most likely has some type of lead paint on it. So the primary step in preventing lead poisoning, and the primary location that kids get lead poisoning is typically from the home. And so the same practices that would go into preventing lead poisoning in your home would go into presenting, because you can track contaminants from anywhere into your home. And so maintaining a good, clean home, maintaining your surfaces intact, your painted surfaces intact, friction-bearing surfaces, all goes to reducing the risk of lead poisoning regarding the lead. The same, if you're cleaning your house on a regular basis, it would go to reducing the other exposures that are present in some of the materials that we have here. And so that would be my recommendation, is continue with your routine cleaning in your homes and address it in that way.
Are there other questions? Any closing Oh, good.
I'm Stephanie on Beach Road. I'm new to Fairfield as of a year. So the contaminants that have been deemed safe, the levels have been deemed safe in the fields, parks, wherever. I'm still curious to know how they compare to surrounding towns. If you were to take like an average field in a surrounding town, have you done any testing to compare? I guess this is for Tighe Bond. Have you done any testing to compare to neighboring towns or schools in other states? And can you confidently say that the levels that are coming back as safe are on par with those baseline levels of other towns and schools?
As part of the town's work, we haven't tested any adjacent towns' fields, but based on my experience, the types of contaminants we're finding are very prevalent and ubiquitous in the environment. pH compounds, which typically come from like asphalt type materials, are in roadways. They're on the edges of roadways and soils. They end up in fill that's used just because there's so much of this material out there. So, I'm not surprised to see pHs in fill materials on these fields. Use of fill historically has been fairly unregulated. Even to this day, it's fairly unregulated. DEEP has tried to pass regulations, to provide more, rules and procedures for using fill, and it hasn't passed yet. So what I'm, seeing in these fields is, these low-level pHs is common of fill materials. What we're not seeing is high levels of lead, PCBs, which would be, much more significant. And then, there's some parts of the state where you see, like where there's old tobacco fields, you can see a lot of residual pesticides, like up in the Connecticut Valley, up towards Bradley Field in that area. So
I'll just tell you, typically catch basin waste material that comes off the road, goes into a storm drain, and is basically collected in there and then cleaned out, which is required as part of our stormwater permit for the state. That has levels that are higher in it of PAHs and metals than basically what we're seeing on the fields. It's just really ubiquitous in the environment. One of the problems is when you have asphalt and it starts to degrade, and it gets to that point where it's degrading, it's going to run off either in stormwater or you have a plow truck coming around and it's pushing the top layer off into the snow shelf. If you're going to test those areas, you're going to find it. That's why it's very problematic when you start testing, for PAHs, because you are going to find it anywhere. And there are other compounds like lead and arsenic that can have background levels. But what we're not finding it in all of the areas which was subject of the remediation of the Julian Pile when that was first going on was PCBs. So, where, I can't tell you where the origin is of a lot of the fill, but it's basically because you're seeing asphalt fragments in some of it. So
has the baseline level for Fairfield, that's on par?
So it's hard to say
Not for
baseline
PCBs?
because a lot of these materials are industrial based. So if you have a factory and then there's a field next to it, and that factory is operating for 50, 60 years, and there's runoff or something, you're going to find that not from the town's perspective caused, but from adjacent. Most of our schools have been tested, and there's these low level spots in 1 or 2 samples when there's 20 or 30 samples that have been collected through a lot of these areas.
And before any of this controversy happened with the fill pile, is there any testing that's done by schools just in general, like an annual or every 5 years, or just to test material around schools?
I mean,
Playscapes?
I think SANS deals with that more. I know that, I think before there's any construction done in the schools, they have to go through and, basically, if you're going to remove windows or things like that, they'll go through and assess it for, hazardous building materials so that those are dealt with during the construction process.
Yeah, so all the schools have been tested for a variety of items, and they have management plans for those. And so there's routine. A lot of the schools have licensed, like what they call licensed daycares in them. There, after-school programs and things like that. That requires periodic lead testing of the water and some lead testing of the surfaces. So that happens on a regular basis as licenses are renewed. So there is that level of testing, and the schools have management plans for the materials that they have in them. That there's different materials and different tests throughout the schools that they manage, and when there's work that impacts those areas, as Brian said, there's additional testing that happens, and then if they know they're disturbing an area where there is a known presence there, they have to address that and abate that appropriately.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yes.
Good evening. My name is Liz Esma. I live at 160 Fairfield Woods Road, and I serve on the Board of Finance. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Can you help me with distinguish between toxins, contaminants, and hazardous materials? I hear these words being used interchangeably, and especially with respect to the findings here in town.
Yeah, the way it's defined in the Connecticut Remediation Standard Regulations, which as an LEP or licensed environmental professional, that's what I follow when I clean sites up. The remediation standard regulations of the RSRs, there's different classifications of soil. You have, starting from probably, you have natural soil, which is not impacted, which, most of Connecticut's soil is impacted by some degree by previous uses or atmospheric fallout, or if it's near a highway, it's impacted. We're a small state, heavily urbanized and industrialized. So you have natural soil, then you have polluted soil. Polluted soil is soil that has some degree of impact, but it's below cleanup standards. So it can stay on the site, it's safe according to DEEP's regulations, and we found in some of these fields there's some of this polluted soil. Then if you keep going, to a higher degree of impact, you have we call it Connecticut regulated waste, which has concentrations of contaminants above cleanup levels that something needs to be done. And then if you go farther up, you have hazardous waste, which are subject to federal regulation under RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which are significantly impacted materials have to be handled in a certain way. Then you have PCB waste, which are subject to TSCA. So those are the general different types of waste classifications. Toxicity is really a measure of, the degree that particular contaminant impacts, human health or organisms.
So just for clarification, the original spot where the contaminated material was dumped at the fill pile that was isolated, that was Connecticut regulated waste. There was one hit, and then, I think we took like 60 samples that did have a T-clip, that defines the levels of toxicity of lead, but nothing else up there is ever tested for, anything that would be hazardous waste under the Code of Federal Regulations.
Yeah, and of all of our investigations we've done at all these fields, we found natural soils, polluted soils. We found some areas that are regulated waste that need cleanup. We haven't found any hazardous waste. We found some asbestos, and we did find one site with very low levels of PCBs. Just one site, just over the standard of 1 part per million.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Hi, Jim Coughlin, 673 Churchill Road. I want to commend you guys for coming up with a whistleblower line. I've been a municipal worker for almost 25 years, and I've seen over the years with many of my colleagues, there's a lot of times where there are concerns that come up, and for many reasons, it's not reported. I guess my concern is when if it's reported anonymously and it goes to a third party, who is that third party that gets that report?
There's a company that does this on a regular basis. We basically contracted with them.
Okay.
So that way it stays, anonymous both by phone and email. Right. So they have the system set up so it doesn't get transferred. I don't know the technology in detail, so I can't describe that to you there, but that the information is, the whole purpose is to make sure it's anonymous, to make sure that the employees know it's anonymous, but also we open up to the public, make sure the public knows it's anonymous too.
Okay. I would have thought through this process that hopefully one of the things that you learned is that there are people probably that knew things that were going on and they weren't reported. So hopefully that will not happen again to this extent. My other concern, I've been watching the Board of Selectmen meetings and I've been watching, reading in the paper and things, is from what I understand, Mr. Bartlett has been terminated. I guess my question is, if he was being criminally investigated, why wasn't he put on leave? And I don't know if you can answer that, if that's a personnel question, but I don't understand. I think a lot of people don't understand why he continued to supervise town employees and run facilities while he's being investigated.
Because the contents or the information in the police investigation was not shared outside of that. So the police knew that, the detective knew that, but nobody outside of the police knew that.
And the police didn't go to the Human Resources Department at any time and have a concern that there's what's going on with this?
They did it one time.
When was that?
I think that was covered at the last Board of Selectmen meeting, and I think we'll be discussing it again. But so off the top of my head, I'm not going to try and relate those dates, but that was specifically asked and answered at the last Board of Selectmen meeting. So it's on FairTV, so you can get that answer directly.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, everybody, for coming. This is Chris Timniak. I'm a member of the Board of Selectmen. To answer your question, it was discussed at the last Board of Selectmen meeting. The HR director did indicate that he knew that Scott Bartlett was part of a potential investigation. We did follow up with the police commission, and I do have in writing from the chief of police exactly what was contained in the report our HR director read. Based upon that, like we mentioned at the last Board of Selectmen meeting, the dots should have been connected. All the information was there in December for your administration to make that decision. And tomorrow's meeting will be interesting because I have a lot more questions to come out. I'm still a little confused on this latest report, the latest committee you want to set up, because I don't have any details on that. I found out through the press that you wanted to put this committee together, and I'm looking at the committee on face value, trying to say, hey, the good intentions for this committee and putting this together, the reality is you're putting this committee together because you've lost the trust of the residents of Fairfield to report the issues to you. We're putting a third-party committee together when it's the role of the Board of Selectmen to handle the oversight. And if people don't have the trust and confidence to come to the Board of Selectmen with their issues and their concerns, it's a failure on us. And it's definitely a failure on you.
Any questions? I know that the panel's going to stay behind for any one-on-one discussions. I have to remark I'm on the fact that I've been around this community a long, long time, and we're right in the middle of an industrial area, and it's pretty hard to move fill around and use fill and find fill that somehow, some way hasn't been impacted by our industrial neighbors or even ourselves when this town had a lot more industry. And I'm sure there are plenty of other towns around that are like us. And I think the most important thing that's happened is that you have a panel or a bunch of individuals, whether they've been retained or working for the town, that are on this, because what you want is multiple regulatory oversight, not just one, to be assured, not just one agency. So it's a tough problem, but it's being addressed. And I have no particular issue to be here other than to help Mike moderate this meeting. Any questions before we close? And then the panel's going to stay behind. Anybody that wants to one-on-one contact?
Good.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.